The slap echoed through the lobby before anyone understood what they had just seen. A woman in a sharp gray suit stood over a man in a wheelchair, her hands still raised, her face twisted with a kind of fury that did not belong in a hospital. He did not flinch, he did not speak. He just looked up at her with eyes that had seen far worse than an open palm. Somewhere outside, faint but growing, a new sound rolled in over the parking lot. A sound like a heartbeat made of metal. In the next 20 minutes, that quiet man in the wheelchair would remind an entire hospital exactly who he was, and no one in that lobby would ever look at a stranger the same way again. Let's go back to where it started 3 days earlier in a small house at the edge of town. Daniel Reyes woke up the way he always did, before the sun, before the birds, before the world remembered it was supposed to be morning. He sat on the edge of his bed for a moment, the way old habit demanded, and listened to the quiet. 20 years in the Navy had taught him to notice silence the way other people notice noise. A silence that felt wrong was a warning. A silence that felt calm was a gift. This one felt calm, and he was grateful for it. He reached for the cane leaning against his nightstand, not because he could not stand without it, but because standing without it cost him more than most people would understand. His left leg had not worked right since a mission in a country he still would not name out loud, even to himself, even in his own kitchen. He made coffee slow, the way he liked it, letting the smell fill the small house before he drank a single drop. On the wall above the stove hung a photograph of 6 men in desert fatigues, squinting into a sun that looked like it wanted to burn the whole frame away. Daniel was second from the left, younger, leaner, his face not yet carved by the years. 2 of the men in that photograph were gone now. One had made it home only to lose a different kind of battle a few years later. Daniel thought of them every morning, not with sadness exactly, but with a kind of steady respect, like a soldier saluting a flag that would never come down. He worked 3 days a week now at a hardware store on the edge of town, mostly because sitting still made his mind wander to places he did not want to visit. The owner, an older man named Pete, never asked questions about the limp or the quiet or the way Daniel sometimes stopped mid-sentence and stared at nothing for a few seconds before continuing. Pete had a nephew who served too. Some things men like that simply understood without needing an explanation. Daniel liked stacking shelves. He liked the small, solvable problems of inventory and paint mixing, and helping an elderly woman find the right size hinge for her cabinet door. It was a small life, but it was his, and after everything, small and quiet felt like winning. That particular week, though small and quiet, was about to end. Daniel had an appointment at the Regional Veterans Affairs Hospital, the big one 2 counties over, the one with the glass entrance and the fountain out front that never seemed to be running. His knee, the good one, had started giving him trouble, a strange ache that would not go away with rest or ice or the stretches his physical therapist had given him months ago. He almost canceled the appointment twice. Something in his gut told him to go anyway. He would later wonder if that gut feeling was less about his knee and more about something else entirely. Something waiting for him in that lobby that he could not have predicted no matter how many years of training sharpened his instincts. The night before the appointment, Daniel sat on his porch and cleaned his old boots out of habit, even though he would not need them for a hospital visit. It was less about the boots and more about the ritual, the same slow motion his hands had made 1,000 times before deployments, before missions, before the kind of nights most people only see in movies. His neighbor, a young mother named Carla, waved from her yard and asked how he was feeling about tomorrow. He told her it was just a knee appointment, nothing serious. She smiled and said she was glad because the whole street sort of counted on him, whether he realized it or not. He laughed it off, but the words stayed with him longer than he expected. Word had gotten around the small town the way it always does that a decorated combat veteran lived quietly among them. Nobody made a big deal of it. Nobody asked him to speak at the school or ride in the parade, mostly because he had asked them not to, twice, politely but firmly. He was not hiding his service. He simply did not want to wear it like a costume. What people did not know, what almost nobody in that town or that hospital would know until the moment demanded it, was the full shape of what Daniel Reyes had done during those 2 decades in uniform. They knew he was a veteran. They did not know H. E had once carried the call sign Ironclad, a name that in certain rooms made grown men go very still. The morning of the appointment arrived gray and cool, the kind of morning that makes a person move a little slower than usual. Daniel drove himself the 90 minutes to the regional hospital in his old blue truck, windows cracked, radio low, the hills rolling by in shades of green he had learned to appreciate more since coming home. He arrived early, as he always did, because waiting was something the military had trained into him permanently. He checked in at the front desk, took a numbered ticket, and wheeled himself over to a row of plastic chairs near the window, choosing the seat that let him see both the entrance and the hallway beyond it. Old instincts. He would keep this quiet moment for one more page because in less than an hour, everything about that lobby was about to change. If a quiet story like this one is already pulling you in, tap that like button so the next story finds you just as easily. The lobby of the regional VA hospital was busier than usual that morning, filled with the low hum of wheelchairs rolling across tile, the beep of a distant monitor, and the occasional cough that echoed a little too loudly in the open space. Daniel sat near the window with his numbered ticket in hand, watching the room the way he always did, cataloging exits, faces, and small details without even meaning to. It was not paranoia. It was simply the way 20 years of training had rewired his brain to read a room before his conscious mind caught up. What he noticed first was not a threat. It was a woman moving through the lobby like she owned every square foot of it, and in a way she did. Her name, though Daniel did not know it yet, was Margaret Voss, and she was the chief executive officer of the hospital system that ran this facility along with four others across the region. She wore a tailored gray suit that looked far too expensive for a public hospital, and she moved with the brisk, clipped energy of someone who measured her days in board meetings and quarterly numbers rather than patients and outcomes. Behind her walked two junior staff members, both younger, both visibly nervous, both trying to keep pace with her long strides while balancing tablets and folders. She was giving a tour to a group of hospital donors that morning, the kind of tour designed to show polish and progress, not the reality of overcrowded waiting rooms and understaffed nursing stations. Margaret had built her career on image. She had taken over the hospital system 4 years earlier after a career in corporate healthcare administration, and under her leadership the buildings had gotten shinier, the lobbies more modern, the press releases more frequent. What had not improved, according to more than a few nurses who dared to whisper it in break rooms, was the actual care patients received once the donors and cameras left the building. She saw the veterans in the waiting room as background noise, inconvenient reminders of an older, less polished version of the hospital she was trying to build. She did not say this out loud, not exactly, but her eyes said it every time they swept across a row of wheelchairs like Daniel's. The donor group paused near the front entrance, admiring a newly installed water feature that had cost more than most nurses made in a year. Margaret gestured toward it with practiced pride, describing the hospital's commitment to a calming, modern, healing environment. One of the donors, an older man in a blazer, asked a simple question about wait times for veterans specifically. Margaret's smile did not waver, but something behind her eyes flickered, the look of someone caught between the truth and the story she wanted to tell. She answered with a vague, polished non-answer about ongoing improvements and strategic staffing initiatives. Daniel, close enough to hear, recognized the sound of someone talking a great deal while saying almost nothing. Near the far wall, a cluster of hospital administrators stood with badges that marked them as part of Margaret's inner circle, the people who had risen alongside her by agreeing with everything she said. One of them, a man named Curtis Boyle, served as her director of operations, and he had a habit of scanning the waiting room the same way Margaret did, as if patients were furniture that occasionally needed rearranging for a better photograph. Curtis noticed Daniel first, actually, seated near the window with his cane resting against his knee, his eyes calm but watchful. Something about the stillness of the man unsettled Curtis, though he could not have explained why if asked. The donor tour moved closer to the waiting area, and that was when the first small friction happened. An elderly veteran in a wheelchair, a man named Walter who had served in Vietnam, accidentally rolled slightly into the path of the group while trying to reach the water fountain. Margaret Stee peeped around him with a visible flash of irritation, muttering something about pathways needing to be kept clear for foot traffic. She did not apologize. She did not even look at Walter directly. She simply adjusted her jacket and kept walking, as if the man in the wheelchair were an obstacle rather than a person who had once bled for the flag that hung near the hospital entrance. Daniel watched this exchange with the same still expression he wore for most things, but something in his jaw tightened slightly. He had seen this kind of person before, not on the battlefield, but in the years since, in offices and hallways and hospital corridors. People who mistook authority for respect, who confused a title with the right to look through people rather than at them. He said nothing. He was there for his knee, not for a confrontation, and he had learned patience the hard way, in places where losing his temper could cost more than dignity. The tour continued deeper into the waiting room, and Margaret's voice carried easily across the space, describing renovation plans and donor recognition walls in a tone that suggested she was already imagining her own name engraved somewhere prominent. Curtis trailed slightly behind her, occasionally leaning in to whisper updates about the schedule. Neither of them noticed or cared to notice that their tour was pushing several patients further back in line as staff paused their normal duties to accommodate the visiting donors. A young nurse named Priya, who had been at the hospital less than a year, shot an apologetic look toward the veterans whose appointments were quietly being delayed by the spectacle moving through their space. If this story already has your attention, drop a comment with the word you'd use to describe Daniel so far. By the time the donor tour looped back toward the front desk, Nearly 40 minutes had passed, and the waiting room had grown restless in the particular way that hospital waiting rooms do, full of sighs and shifting weight and glances at wall clocks. Daniel's number had been called once already, but the intake nurse, flustered by the donor tour rearranging the front desk area, had accidentally skipped him in the confusion. He did not complain. He simply waited, the way he always did, though the muscles along his jaw had begun to tighten just slightly more with each passing minute. Margaret, meanwhile, had grown impatient with what she viewed as an inefficient, cluttered lobby experience for her guests. She turned to Curtis and asked, in a voice not quite quiet enough, why the waiting area could not be cleared more efficiently during scheduled tour. Curtis mumbled something about patient volume and staffing limits, but Margaret was not really listening. She was scanning the room with the flat, assessing gaze of someone evaluating furniture rather than human beings, and her eyes landed again on Daniel, seated calmly near the window, his cane resting against his good leg, his eyes steady and unreadable. Something about his stillness irritated her. She was used to people straightening up when she walked past, adjusting their posture, offering a nervous smile. Daniel did neither. He simply watched her the way a man watches, whether rolling in, aware, unbothered, waiting to see what it would do. Margaret, unused to being unimpressive to anyone, walked directly toward him, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. The donor group paused to watch, sensing, perhaps, that their tour guide was about to demonstrate her authority in a way that had nothing to do with hospital renovations. She asked him in a tone dressed up as politeness but sharpened underneath, whether he had checked in properly, implying without quite saying it that his continued presence in that particular seat was somehow an inconvenience to the group's photographs. Daniel answered simply that he had checked in over half an hour earlier and had been waiting since. His voice was calm, factual, without any edge. Margaret's expression flickered, the look of someone who had expected an apology and received a plain statement of fact instead. She did not like it. Curtis, sensing tension, tried to smooth things over, suggesting quietly that they move the tour toward the east wing instead. Margaret ignored him. She had decided, in the quick and reckless way some people make decisions, that this quiet man in the wheelchair-adjacent seat represented everything wrong with a lobby she wanted to look effortless and polished. She told him, loudly enough now that several nearby patients turned their heads, that perhaps veterans who needed this much time should consider scheduling appointments during less busy hours. The words landed like a slap before her hand ever moved. Walter, the older veteran nearby, opened his mouth to say something in Daniel's defense, but Daniel gave him the smallest shake of his head, a silent request to let it go. He had faced worse than an executive with a bruised ego and a tight schedule. He simply repeated evenly that he had an appointment and intended to wait for it like everyone else in the room. Margaret's jaw clenched. She was not used to calm refusal. She was used to people folding. The donor group shifted uncomfortably, a few of them exchanging glances that suggested even they found her tone excessive. One donor, the same older man from earlier who had asked about veteran wait times, cleared his throat and suggested gently that perhaps they should let the hospital staff handle patient flow. Margaret waved a hand, dismissing the suggestion without looking at him, her focus locked entirely on Daniel now, as if his composure were a personal insult she needed to correct. She stepped closer, close enough that Priya, the young nurse, instinctively moved toward the front desk, sensing something was about to happen that would need documenting. Margaret told Daniel, her voice low but venomous, that people like him needed to understand that the hospital did not exist to babysit veterans who could not manage a simple waiting room. The words hit harder than they should have, not because Daniel doubted his own worth, but because he had heard variations of that sentiment before, from people who had never once worn a uniform or missed a holiday overseas or held a friend's hand as the light left his eyes. Still, Daniel did not raise his voice. He told her plainly that he had served this country for 20 years and intended no disrespect, only to wait his turn like anyone else. It was the calmness in his response, more than any insult, that seemed to unravel something in Margaret. She had built her entire career on being the loudest, most controlling presence in any room, and here was a man in a wheelchair refusing to shrink beneath her volume. Something in her composure cracked audibly, like ice under sudden weight. That crack showed itself half a second later. Her hand moved before her mind fully caught up with her fury, cutting across the small distance between them and landing hard against Daniel's cheek. The sound was sharp, unmistakable, the kind of sound that stops an entire room mid-breath. For a moment, nobody in that lobby moved. Even Curtis froze, his mouth slightly open, his tablet forgotten in his hand. Priya's fingers hovered over the front desk phone, uncertain whether to call security or simply document what she had just witnessed. Daniel did not raise a hand in return. He did not shout. He simply turned his head back toward Margaret slowly, his eyes steady, his jaw set, and something in that look made every donor in that group take an unconscious step backward. It was not anger exactly. It was recognition, the look of a man who had faced far worse threats than an open palm and had never once needed to flinch from any of them. Outside, faint at first but growing steadily louder, a new sound began rolling across the parking lot. A deep, rhythmic thrum that most people in that lobby would not recognize until it was directly overhead. If your stomach just dropped a little, that's the story doing exactly what it's supposed to. Stick around because the next part changes everything. For a moment, the entire lobby existed in a strange, suspended silence, the kind that follows a sound too sharp and too wrong for a hospital. Margaret stood frozen with her hands still slightly raised, as if her body had not yet caught up with what she had done. Curtis finally found his voice, stammering her name in a tone that begged her to step back, to undo what could not be undone. Priya, hands trembling slightly, had already picked up the front desk phone, dialing hospital security with fingers that moved faster than her thoughts. Daniel sat still, one hand resting lightly against the arm of his chair, the red mark blooming slowly across his cheek. He did not touch his face. He did not look away from her. In his eyes was not rage but something colder and steadier, the look of a man recalculating a situation the way he had been trained to recalculate every dangerous moment of his career, weighing what needed to happen next and how much restraint the moment demanded. 20 years in uniform had taught him that the most dangerous man in any room is rarely the loudest one. Walter, the older veteran nearby, rolled his wheelchair half a foot closer, his weathered face tight with anger on Daniel's behalf, but Daniel lifted two fingers slightly off the armrest, a silent signal born from years of nonverbal battlefield communication. Walter understood immediately and held his position, trusting a man he had known for less than an hour because something in Daniel's calm demanded that trust. The donor group had gone completely silent, several of them visibly horrified, one woman covering her mouth with her hand, the older man who had spoken earlier now glaring openly at Margaret with something close to disgust. Margaret, perhaps sensing the shift in the room, tried to recover her composure, straightening her jacket and insisting in a clipped voice that the veteran had been disruptive, that she had simply reacted to disrespect. Her words came out too fast, too defensive, the tone of someone building an excuse rather than stating a fact. Nobody in that lobby believed her, least of all the people who had just watched her raise her hand against a man who had not moved an inch, had not raised his voice, had done nothing but ask to wait his turn. That was when the low, rhythmic thrum outside grew undeniable, vibrating faintly through the hospital's glass entrance. A few patients near the windows turned to look outside, murmuring in confusion as the sound deepened, closer now, unmistakably a helicopter descending somewhere nearby. Curtis, still pale, glanced nervously toward the entrance, some old instinct telling him this was connected to the man in the wheelchair, though he could not explain why he felt it so strongly. Daniel exhaled slowly, the first movement he had made since the slap. He reached into his jacket pocket, not for a weapon, not for anything dramatic, but for a small, worn identification card he rarely carried and even more rarely showed. His hands were steady despite the sting still radiating across his cheek. He held the card up not toward Margaret, but toward Priya at the front desk, quietly asking her to call a name and a number listed on the back, a contact he had not used in years but had never removed from his wallet. Priya, hands still trembling, read the card and her eyes widened. She recognized the emblem stamped into its corner, an insignia she had seen only once before, during a hospital security briefing about protocols for visiting decorated service members. She dialed the number with a kind of reverence she did not fully understand yet, her voice hushed as she read the details to whoever answered on the other end. Within moments, her expression shifted from confusion to something like disbelief. Margaret, oblivious to what was unfolding at the front desk, was still trying to salvage the situation with the donors, insisting loudly that hospital protocol had been followed, that difficult patients required firm management. Her voice cracked slightly under the weight of her own lie. The older donor who had questioned her earlier stepped forward, quietly informing her that he had witnessed the entire exchange and that nothing about her behavior resembled protocol or management. He said he intended to speak with the hospital board personally before the end of the day. Outside, the helicopter's thrum had become a physical presence, rattling the windows slightly, drawing the attention of nearly everyone left in the lobby. Two hospital security guards jogged toward the entrance, not to intervene in the altercation, but to clear the parking lot for what was clearly an unscheduled and highly unusual landing. Curtis pressed his face near the glass, watching in stunned silence as a sleek gray military helicopter descended smoothly onto the hospital's front lawn, kicking up a wide circle of wind that bent the nearby trees and scattered loose papers from a nearby bulletin board. Margaret finally turned, drawn by the sudden shift of every eye in the room away from her and toward the window. Her face, still flushed with anger moments earlier, drained of color as she watched the helicopter's side door slide open. Two uniformed figures stepped out first, standing at sharp attention beside the aircraft, scanning the hospital entrance with the practiced awareness of men who had done this 100 times before. Margaret's mouth opened slightly, though no words came out. Daniel rose slowly from his seat, leaning briefly on his cane, and for the first time since the slap, something like a small, tired smile crossed his face, not directed at Margaret, but at the two men now crossing the lawn toward the entrance. He recognized their walk before he could make out their faces clearly, the particular rhythm of movement shared only by men who had once crawled through the same mud, carried the same weight, buried the same friends. Behind them, a third figure emerged from the helicopter, older, silver-haired, wearing a uniform heavy with decoration that even Margaret, in her ignorance, understood signified rank far beyond anything she had ever encountered in her career. If you've ever had a quiet person surprise you completely, tell us about it in the comments before the story wraps up. The lobby door slid open, and the three men crossed the threshold with a kind of unhurried authority that made every hospital employee within sight instinctively straighten their posture. The two younger men in uniform flanked the older, silver-haired officer as he approached, his eyes scanning the room once before landing on Daniel. Recognition passed between them instantly, the kind of recognition that does not require words, built instead from years of shared history that neither man needed to explain to anyone else in T. Hat lobby. The silver-haired man was Rear Admiral Thomas Griggs, though almost nobody in that hospital would learn his full title until later that afternoon, when hospital administration quietly pulled his information for their own records. Griggs had served alongside Daniel more than a decade earlier, during a mission that neither man discussed openly, one of those missions that existed more as rumor than record in most circles, the kind whispered about in veteran support groups with careful, respectful silence. Griggs crossed the lobby floor and extended his hand, and Daniel took it firmly, the two men exchanging a brief, quiet greeting that carried far more weight than its short length suggested. Margaret, still frozen near the front desk, watched this exchange with dawning horror, the pieces slowly assembling themselves in her mind. The quiet veteran she had struck in front of donors and staff was not simply another anonymous patient in her waiting room. He was someone with connections reaching directly into the highest levels of military command, someone important enough that a Navy helicopter had been dispatched within the hour of a single phone call. Her earlier bravado evaporated entirely, replaced by the pale, stammering realization that she had made a catastrophic mistake in front of an audience that would not forget it. Griggs turned toward her then, his expression calm but unmistakably firm, the look of a man who did not need to raise his voice to command a room. He asked simply what had happened, his tone even giving her the chance to explain herself, though something in his eyes suggested he already understood the shape of the truth from the tension still hanging in the air and the fading red mark on Daniel's cheek. Margaret opened her mouth to offer some version of her earlier excuse, but the words seemed to catch somewhere in her throat, unable to survive contact with the calm authority standing in front of her. It was Priya, the young nurse, who spoke first, her voice shaking slightly but clear, recounting exactly what she had witnessed from her position at the front desk. She described the donor tour, the impatience, the dismissive words, and finally the slap, delivered without provocation against a man who had done nothing but ask to wait his turn. Several other witnesses, including Walter and the older donor, added their own accounts, each version matching the others closely enough that no reasonable person could doubt what had actually occurred. Griggs listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening slightly with each detail, though his composure never fully broke. When the accounts finished, he turned his attention back to Daniel, and something quiet passed between them, an unspoken exchange built from years of trusting each other's judgment in situations far more dangerous than a hospital lobby. Daniel gave a small nod, confirming without elaborating that the accounts were accurate, that this was indeed what had happened, though his tone carried no desire for revenge, only a request that the truth be acknowledged plainly. Griggs addressed Margaret directly then, his voice still level but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority that made even the donor group instinctively step back. He informed her that the man she had struck held a distinguished record of service that had earned him recognition at levels far above anything she likely understood, though he made clear almost gently that rank and title were not the reason her actions were unacceptable. Her actions would have been unacceptable against anyone in that lobby, veteran or otherwise, and the fact that she had chosen to display that behavior in front of donors and vulnerable patients made the failure even harder to excuse. Margaret tried once more to explain herself, her voice smaller now, stripped of its earlier confidence, insisting she had been under pressure from the tour schedule, that she had not meant for things to escalate the way they had. Griggs listened politely but did not soften his expression. He told her plainly that pressure was not an excuse for cruelty, and that a hospital built to serve veterans should never be led by someone who viewed those veterans as obstacles to a polished photograph. His words were calm, measured, and utterly devastating in their simplicity. Curtis, watching his boss unravel in real time, seemed to shrink several inches, suddenly very interested in the tile beneath his shoes. The donor group had gone completely silent, several of them exchanging glances that suggested this incident would follow Margaret far beyond that single afternoon. The older donor who had spoken up earlier approached Griggs quietly, introducing himself and offering to provide a full account for whatever review process would follow. Griggs thanked him with a brief nod, already sensing that this moment would ripple far beyond the lobby's walls before the day was finished. Daniel, for his part, remained remarkable, cably calm throughout the exchange, more focused on Walter and the other veterans nearby than on any desire to see Margaret publicly humiliated. He crossed the room slowly, leaning on his cane, and knelt slightly beside Walter's wheelchair, asking quietly whether he was all right, whether the appointment could still be sorted out despite the chaos. It was a small gesture, easy to miss amid the larger drama unfolding nearby, but it told everyone watching exactly who Daniel Reyes truly was beneath the calm exterior and the fading mark on his cheek. If this moment gave you chills, hit subscribe so you never miss the next story like it. News of what happened in that lobby did not stay contained for long. By the time Daniel finally saw a doctor for his knee, word had already spread through the hospital's break rooms and hallways, carried by nurses and orderlies who had heard fragments of the story from Priya or from patients who witnessed it firsthand. Some details grew slightly with each retelling, the way stories always do, but the core of it remained untouched. A hospital executive had struck a decorated veteran in front of donors, and a Navy helicopter had landed on the lawn less than an hour later. Rear Admiral Griggs stayed at the hospital for nearly 2 hours that day, speaking privately with hospital board members who had been hastily summoned once word reached them of what had transpired. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply laid out, calmly and clearly, what had occurred, supported by the consistent accounts of multiple witnesses, and asked the board directly whether this was the kind of leadership they intended to continue supporting at a facility meant to serve people like Daniel. The board members, visibly shaken, promised a full internal review within the week. Margaret was placed on administrative leave that same afternoon, escorted quietly from the building by hospital security while the donor group watched in stunned, uncomfortable silence. She did not argue. She did not protest. Something in her had gone hollow since the moment she realized exactly who she had struck, and by the time she reached her car in the parking lot, several employees later admitted they saw her sitting behind the wheel for nearly 10 minutes before finally starting the engine, her hands still trembling slightly against the steering wheel. Daniel, meanwhile, finally got his knee examined by a young orthopedic doctor who treated him with a gentleness that felt almost apologetic, as if trying to make up for the chaos of the morning. The appointment revealed a minor tear that would require physical therapy but no surgery, a relief that felt strangely small compared to everything else that had happened that day. As he left the exam room, several nurses and staff members quietly thanked him, not for anything dramatic, but simply for the calm way he had carried himself through a moment that could have gone very differently. Walter, still waiting in the lobby when Daniel emerged, rolled over to shake his hand, his eyes a little misty as he told Daniel that watching him handle the situation reminded him why he had always believed the quiet ones were the strongest ones. Daniel accepted the words with a small, tired smile, deflecting credit the way he always did, insisting that anyone in that chair would have done the same. Walter simply shook his head slowly, clearly unconvinced, but he did not push the point further. Griggs offered Daniel a ride home in the helicopter, half joking, half serious, but Daniel declined with a quiet laugh, saying his old blue truck had gotten him this far and he trusted it to get him the rest of the way. The two men embraced briefly before Griggs departed, promising to visit properly sometime soon, away from cameras and lobbies and chaos. As the helicopter lifted off the lawn and disappeared over the tree line, the hospital slowly returned to its normal rhythm, though something in the air felt different, quieter, more careful. News outlets picked up a small version of the story within a few days, mostly local coverage focused on hospital accountability rather than any desire from Daniel to be in the spotlight. He declined every interview request that came his way, preferring instead to let the story fade quietly into the background of his ordinary life. He returned to the hardware store the following week, stacking shelves, mixing paint, helping customers find the right size hinge, exactly as he had before, though Pete noticed a subtle shift in how people in town looked at him now, not with pity but with a kind of quiet, earned respect. The hospital, under new interim leadership, launched a full review of how veterans were treated throughout its intake and waiting processes, eventually implementing changes that shortened wait times and improved staff training around patient dignity. Priya, the young nurse whose calm handling of the crisis had not gone unnoticed, was later promoted to a leadership role within patient services, a shift she credited entirely to watching Daniel's composure that day and understanding, finally, what real strength actually looked like. Margaret Voss did not return to her position. The board's internal review confirmed what dozens of witnesses had already described, and within a month her resignation was formally accepted, closing a chapter that had defined her career for years but would now be remembered for a single, reckless afternoon. Whatever came next for her remained unknown to most of the people whose lives she had touched, though few in that hospital found themselves thinking of her with anything beyond quiet relief that she was gone. If a story about quiet strength winning out means something to you, leave a comment and let the next person scrolling by know it's worth their time. Weeks passed, and the incident slowly settled into the kind of local legend that small towns hold onto gently, retold occasionally at diners and church gatherings, always ending with the same detail that seemed to capture people's imagination the most: the sound of a Navy helicopter landing on a hospital lawn because one quiet man asked for help from an old friend who never forgot him. Daniel never encouraged the retellings, but he also never corrected them, understanding that some stories mattered less for their exact details and more for what they reminded people to value. On a cool evening about a month later, Daniel sat on his porch the way he always did, cleaning his boots out of habit, watching the sun dip low behind the hills. Carla, his neighbor, walked over with her young son trailing behind her, the boy staring up at Daniel with the wide, curious eyes children reserve for people they sense are special, even if they cannot explain why. Carla told Daniel that her son had been asking about the story from the hospital, wanting to know if it was true that a real Navy commander had landed a helicopter just to check on him. Daniel smiled softly and knelt down slightly to the boy's level, telling him gently that it was not about the helicopter at all, that it was really about people looking out for one another, the way friends do, the way neighbors do, the way any decent person should. The boy nodded seriously, clearly filing the lesson away somewhere important, before running off to chase a firefly blinking near the fence line. Carla thanked Daniel quietly, not just for the story, but for the quiet example he had set for the whole street without ever meaning to. Walter visited a few times that month too, driving out from the city just to sit on Daniel's porch and talk about nothing in particular: old stories, old friends, the strange comfort of shared silence between two men who understood each other without needing many words. During one of those visits, Walter mentioned that the hospital had sent him a formal letter of apology, along with several policy updates aimed at treating veterans with more patience and respect. Daniel read the letter briefly, nodded once, and set it aside, more interested in whether the changes would actually hold than in the apology itself. Griggs called occasionally, two brief conversations that never lasted long but always left Daniel smiling faintly afterward. During one call, Griggs mentioned that word of the incident had traveled further than either of them expected, reaching other veteran support organizations who had begun using it as an example in trainings about dignity and respect in healthcare settings. Daniel brushed off the attention as he always did, insisting he had simply done what anyone should have done in his place: waited his turn, told the truth, and let the consequences fall where they belonged. At the hardware store, Pete began noticing more veterans stopping by, some just to say hello, some to quietly thank Daniel for a story they had heard secondhand, though Daniel rarely spoke of it himself unless directly asked. He remained the same steady presence he had always been, stacking shelves, mixing paint, helping an elderly customer find the right size hinge, content in the ordinary rhythm of a life he had fought hard to reclaim after decades of service most people would never fully understand. One evening, as autumn crept closer and the porch light buzzed softly against the gathering dusk, Daniel sat alone with a cup of coffee, looking out at the quiet street he called home. He thought, not for the first time, about the men in that old photograph above his stove, the ones who had not made it back to see mornings like this one. He thought about the strange, unexpected way that morning at the hospital had unfolded, not something he had wanted, but something that had, in its own quiet way, reminded an entire community what dignity actually looked like when it refused to raise its voice. He set his coffee down, leaned back in his chair, and let the evening settle around him the way it always did, slow and steady and unbothered by noise of the world beyond his small street. Somewhere far off, faint enough that most people would have missed it entirely, the low thrum of a distant helicopter passed overhead on its way toward some other mission, some other story, and Daniel simply watched it go, a small, knowing smile settling quietly onto his face as the last light of the day faded gently behind the hills.